to introduce Neil Kendall to our viewing audience. Neil is going to take you on a trip that involves looking into the data, the scientific data that supports design in nature. And I can assure you that although this is not part of his basic training, in his college training, he has been very interested in scientific development for a number of years, and not in any superficial manner. He has considerable perception and understanding of this field, and I think you'll enjoy his presentation. He presently works in technical marketing. He lives here in Syracuse. He lives here in Chicago. I live in Syracuse. I'm drifting back to medical school.
Busted.
He has two daughters, ages 15 and 16, and he's also involved in a major career change. His company was purchased recently, and he said his workload is about double, so they're guaranteed a good year this year. With that, I give you to Neil.
All right, thank you. Thank you, folks at home. Honored to have a chance to present the paper, which was more of a book. You've seen it. Apologize for that. You can get by reading the summaries for the first half. I probably should have mentioned that. Most of the front half is set up for the second half pertaining to the mind. If you have the paper, the book at home, and you want to search for some things that I'm talking about on the screen, that might be a decent idea. Okay, I have a lot to cover. I've had to make several Sophie's choices on what to cover and what not to cover. I'm probably going to go an hour and then have a half hour for questions. So, the challenge was this: identify scientific facts and concepts, that's a key word there, that indicate intelligent planning of the universe. I'll let you read that. I can't read every word of all the slides I put up here. The Midway's report, blah, 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 leave no doubt that there was intelligent planning and design. Okay. Give you a second just to glance at that. Okay, the premises of my paper is one, materialism will reap a dire harvest, as this statement will attest to. And secondly, if there is a God, then it's my view that a reasonable person with a bit of perseverance should be able to make the rational case for his existence. In other words, the God hypothesis should be rationally well-grounded, okay? This is the syllogism, the high-level argument of the paper. Materialism's ascendancy. Materialism is the dominant philosophy among educated people in the developed world. I don't think many people would contest that at the moment. And in my opinion, represents the greatest impediment to a renaissance and to religion. And I think the previous quote bears that out. The second point is the unassailability of science and materialism. The continued unraveling of neo-Darwinism, which is perhaps the scientific story of the century, will be, demonstrates that the authority of science and the scientific pronouncements and materialism itself are not unassailable. I'm just going to abbreviate this to complexity, and I'll describe what that is. Complexity in human intellect, because material causes and teleological causes constitute a binary proposition. The inability of material causes to account for the complexity that we see in living organisms and in mind allows us to make a strong inference of design. So the binary proposition comes about by the fact that if material causes are not sufficient, 100% sufficient to account for the complexity, then there's something else. The only other thing would be design, because since it's a binary proposition, by law of the excluded middle, there's nothing else. So if material causes can't explain it, design must be involved some way, somehow. Okay, now I'm going to break down the syllogism a little bit into 3 steps, or each part into a couple different steps. I talked about this. Materialism is destructive to humanity. Now, of course, you get a debate from Neil deGrasse Tyson, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Lawrence Krauss, Sean Carroll. And of these folks right here, personally, I think their arguments are kind of cartoonish. That's my opinion. Steven Pinker wrote a book called Better Angels of Our Nature, I think, which is makes the best attempt to for the claim that materialism might be better, secular humanism might be better than religion. It's beyond the scope of the paper to go into that, so I won't. I'll just leave you again with this statement here. In this audience, I don't think we're going to contest this point. And by the way, this statement in the Urantia book was before the Stalin-induced Russian famine, World War II, the Chinese Great Leap Forward famine, the Korean War, the Khmer Rouge genocide, and Rwanda civil war. So maybe that's the totality of the dire consequences that we're expecting, but something tells me that's not the case, unfortunately. The near universal acceptance of materialism in academia is founded generally on the spectacular success of science. Science has been unbelievably successful. There is absolutely no question about that. This is not an indictment of science. And is specifically the perceived success of neo-Darwinism. The argument from design, teleology, the God hypothesis, is believed to have been nullified by materialists by neo-Darwinism. The acceptance of materialism and the denial of teleology has led to scientism, the idea that science is infallible and science is the only way to understand truth. Materialism and scientism is probably growing because, probably I say, I don't know that for certain, because materialism is a dominant view in academia. So as young people matriculate through the universities, they're sort of indoctrinated the whole idea. Everybody in my office, when you talk to people, it's just implicit that there is no material mind. Everything is related to the brain. There's nothing else. There's a statement in your Urantia book. At the time of this writing, key point, the worst of the materialist age was over. The higher minds, so forth, you can read that. That was at the time of the writing. I'm not sure that that's true today. I don't think the higher minds are no longer materialistic. I think the higher minds are materialistic. What's changed? Very, very interesting. I think, number one, the modern synthesis, neo-Darwinism, was formulated in the 30s and the 40s. The events of World War II may have changed things. And I don't know if you're familiar with Thomas Nagel. He's a world-famous philosopher. Wrote a book called Mind and Cosmos. He's an atheist, by the way. Why the materialist neo-Darwinian conception of nature is almost certainly false. He puts this very interesting statement in the book. And I'm just going to draw your attention to the bolded part. In a rapid historical shift, the causes of which are somewhat obscure, idealism was displaced in the later 20th century analytic philosophy by attempts to unify from the opposite direction, from the material. Okay, so idealism is just the idea of the belief in God, that we're a reflection of a greater reality. We're all idealists. So I think the answer to his, remember Nagel said, somewhat obscure. I think the answer is this gentleman, Stephen Robbins, in his book Time, Memory, and a Primer on Scientific Mysticism and Consciousness, seems to indicate that, or you can infer from what he said, that what caused that is in the early 70s, philosophers of mind became enamored with the idea of computational theory of mind. And they saw, you know what? These neurons, they either fire or they don't. It's just like a computer. It's either a logical 1 or logical 0. And from that, it seemed that it just re-energized materialism. That's my theory, and I think he's correct about that. The second breakdown of the second part of the syllogism, neo-Darwinism theory is unraveling. I have a series of quotes to share with you. That is absolutely the case. Mutations are not random. Evolutionary change is not small or incremental. There are things like orphan genes, de novo genes that just pop up out of nowhere. Overlapping genes where you have, try to write a sentence that depending on where you start, it would have a different meaning. It's nearly impossible. That's what nature has done. There are genes, if you look at my paper, I have a little depiction of it. You have a string of DNA, okay? This part is pulled out, then an overlapping part is pulled out, another gene, another protein, another overlapping section. There's things called alternative splicing, RNA editing, extraordinarily complex. Cell fusion, symbiosis demonstrate that mutations are not random, evolutionary change is not small. The protein sampling problem, huge problem. Let me give you an analogy. If you took 100 text characters, what would be the chance if you randomly generated them, that there would be a meaningful sentence? It's about 10 to the 100th power. Just ungodly impossible. This is the same kind of problem. What series or what percentage of DNA strings code for a viable protein, can fold up and actually do something? There's been several studies. The most recent one was conducted by an intelligent design scientist, Doug Axe. And he calculated it's 10 to the 77th power for a protein that's only 150 residues. Residues are amino acids. Most are minimally 300. Some, you mentioned 1,500. So imagine how this number would be much higher for a much higher, much larger protein. And keep in mind that for any biologic function, it usually requires a molecular machine which is comprised of many proteins, and oftentimes it takes more than one machine to do any particular task. For example, to just unzip and copy the DNA, there's polymerase, there's heliocase, and there's a bunch of other binding proteins that are involved in just copying the DNA. And I have links to all the animations in the paper to those activities. Still no real clear hope of coming up with an origin of life scenario. Kunin is a world-famous evolutionary biologist. He's a materialist. He's probably an atheist. I don't know that for certain. He calculated it's 10 to the minus 1,018th power. And from that he concludes, you know what? The only way you can hold to a naturalistic cause of the origin of life is to say that there's an infinite number of universes out there. So he amortizes the chances over infinity, effectively. Because this number is well beyond what's called the universal probability bound. If you take the number of particles in the universe and the smallest increment of time, the Planck time, you get a number that's 10 to the 123rd. So this is almost 900 orders of magnitude beyond what's even theoretically possible. And his is the most optimistic theory. Stephen Meyer, an intelligent design scientist, calculated it as 10 to the minus 40,000. And that's not even based, that's only just a crude assessment of how many proteins you would need, and then just adding up the exponents. In other words, he's not saying organize in such a way to work, which is a really hard problem. Craig Ventnor took an existing cell, the most primitive one, and deprecated a bunch of different genes to see what the minimum number of genes would be. And it was 240, which is slightly smaller than what Meyer came up with, but the number would still be much higher than that, somewhere between these two. Impossibly complex. In light of the above, the authority of scientific pronouncements cannot be considered unassailable. Promissory materialism, when you're debating, which I do commonly on various threads, a very common rejoinder to whatever you say about probabilities is, they'll figure it out. We'll figure it out. They have an unbounded faith in science to be able to figure out even the impossible. That's the term promissory materials, and that's what that means. But it's not unlimited. It's certainly not unlimited. That's why math is such a good thing. We can, assign numbers to it. Now, it's usually the intelligent design guys that are really motivated to falsify neo-Darwinism. By the way, intelligent design, at least in this regard, is absolutely science. So using the probabilities of mathematics and their knowledge of biology to falsify a theory. Falsifying a theory is partly a scientific method, so it's absolutely partly science in that regard. Okay. Oh, the universe cannot be said to be causally closed to immaterial causes. This is a question Nigel asked about an interface. According to quantum physics. Now, that's according to Copenhagen interpretation, which is Phil's least favorite interpretation of it, but it's the most widely accepted. Even you'll admit that. Okay. Consciousness, self-awareness, qualia. Qualia is called the hard problem of consciousness. It's really not the hardest problem. What it is you taste sugar. Why does it taste like sugar? You see red. Why do you perceive red? That's actually an easy problem. Intentionality, where is it? Intentionality is a medieval term. It's not what you think it is. Intentionality is simply the ability to think about something. So intentionality is, if you're walking in a forest and rain's falling and you're hearing the leaves touching trees, all that's qualia, that's perception. If you're laying in bed thinking about that, you're thinking about it, that is intentionality. Imagination. Think of it as imagination. They're profound mysteries. No hope. When you talk to people who are so sure that the brain is all there is, they assume that these problems are already solved. They have no idea that we have no clue how any of this stuff works. No clue. The best materialist view of mind, the emergent theory of mind, property dualism, is fraught with intractable operational difficulties. I lay them all out, and it's probably just the tip of the iceberg in my paper. I can only talk about some of them here. A lot of them pertain to something called an infinite regress, which I will discuss. If material causes cannot account for complexity in nature, then a reassessment of the nullification of teleology, the God hypothesis, is necessary. Complexity is exhibited in living organisms by phenomenon of the origin of life, the evolution of life, and most importantly, human intellect. So, what I'm going to do now is very briefly address the question of why is it that I feel neo-Darwinism is falling apart. I make the case in the paper, but I'm just going to throw a bunch of quotes at you. None of these guys are intelligent design guys. They are all agnostics or atheists who are following the facts. Okay, so this is what the book says, right? James Shapiro, University of Chicago. First statement in his book, innovation, not selection. Boom. Neo-Darwinism is dead. Neo-Darwinism is based on natural selection. That's the primary driving force. He says innovation, mutation, but he doesn't say mutation because he views the cells as being intelligent and they engineer their own changes, which is what these other statements say. Organisms actively change themselves, modify their genomes, and is a major accomplishment of the 20th century, the figuring that out. Conventional evolutionary theory made the simplifying assumption, there was never any proof, that novelty was a result of chance or accident. The proof that they thought they had is completely evaporated. And I have a section of that in my book. Again, James Shapiro. The Darwinists detest this guy, by the way. Okay, genome alterations, multiple cellular characters. These rapid multi-character changes are fundamentally different from these small, slowly accumulating small random variations postulated by Darwinism and neo-Darwinism. It's difficult, if not impossible, to find a genome change operator that is truly random. All careful studies of mutagenesis find statistically significant, non-random patterns of change. The evidence is that both the speed and the location of genome change can be influenced functionally. Now you might say, well, maybe this guy's just one off. If you read his papers, there's a bunch of studies that he cites. This is not something he's researching and just making up. This is the science. Another thing, so he asked the rhetorical question. Is this the one? Yeah. Do the sequences of contemporary genomes fit the prediction of change by numerous successive slight modifications, as Darwin said? No, the data are overwhelmingly in favor of the saltation of sudden change, macro, sudden change. School thought that possibly major genomic changes at key moments in evolution. Eugene Koonin, he was the one that calculated the origin of life. Major transitions in biology, evolution, sudden emergence of new levels of complexity in all these things, proteins, supergroups, and animal phyla. This includes the Cambrian explosion. In these pivotal nexuses of life, the principal types seem to appear rapidly and fully equipped with the signature features of the respective new level of biologic organization. No intermediate grades or intermediate forms between different types are detectable. The fossil record has always shown that. The fossil record has never shown as supported neo-Darwinism. It has supported common descent, not neo-Darwinism. If I had to pick one smoking gun for why evolution or neo-Darwinism is false, it'd be this little guy. What you're looking at is a single cell. But guess what? This single cell has an eye that's structured in the same manner as a multicellular eye. So it shows two things. It shows complexity, and it shows a conformance to a pattern, a design. But it's made up of completely different parts. It's not made of cells. It's made up of distinct molecules. Impossible to explain. Eerily similar to the mammalian eye, a single-celled organism. And it uses this eye to move around as if it had a mind. I think it has a mind. Thomas Nagel said, he's addressing intelligent design, and he's actually defending intelligent design in his book. Whatever you think about the idea of a design, the appearance of life from dead matter and its evolution through accidental mutation and natural selection to its present forms has involved nothing but the operation of physical law, cannot be regarded as unassailable. Dennis Noble. Actually, I'm going to skip that quote and move on to something else he said. Another well-known, famous philosopher or scientist. All the central assumptions of modern synthesis, neo-Darwinism, have been disproven. This is all in the past 20 years. And he goes on to talk about maybe a different way of looking at things. This is one of my favorite quotes. Again, Thomas Nagel. At the end of his book, he says, I find this view, the view that neo-Darwinism was true, antecedently, in retrospect, unbelievable. A heroic triumph of ideology over common sense. Because there was never any evidence for it. When I started looking into this 25 years ago, I said, where's the beef? There's just nothing here. It's all stories. The human will to believe is inexhaustible. Okay, is the universe causally closed? When you're arguing debate, the other thing besides promissory materialism, they'll figure it out. The other thing that they throw at you all the time is, you know what? When I posted some falsifications of materialism, they said, you know what? Yeah, I don't know what. I don't know. I don't know the answer. But there's no way that an immaterial mind can affect the brain because the universe is causally closed. End of story. They walk away from the forum. They won't even entertain the question. Well, that is based on. So here's Daniel Dennett, his statement. You can read it. And this is up front in his book. And so he's done. Okay, now we can move on and explain why consciousness is an illusion. This guy had a very funny quote. The the horniest objection. I had to look up what that word meant. wasn't what I thought. This argument may well hold the all-time record. This argument meaning the causal closure of the universe. May hold the all-time record for overrated objections to a major philosophic position. Okay, so a little background on quantum mechanics here. If you want to find out, if you want to read about quantum mechanics, I would recommend this book by these two gentlemen. They're MIT physicists, Quantum Enigma, Physics Encounters Consciousness. Fascinating book. Very easy to read. This is their description of why it could be perceived that the universe is not causally closed, because of this inherent probability. Things are probabilistic. There's no certainty according to Copenhagen. They subscribe to Copenhagen. In quantum mechanics, the position of an object is not independent of its observation at that position. The observed cannot be separated from the observer. Actually, I thought there's a better quote. Maybe I could have used there, but the point is that actually the point is made right here. Classical physics, that's Newtonian physics, deterministic, allows no mechanism for top-down conscious influence. There's a quantum loophole in Dennett's argument. He's commenting specifically about Daniel Dennett. And he's a theoretical quantum physicist. Henry Stape is his name. No mass or energy is necessarily required to determine which of the set of possible states a quantum wave function will collapse into. So when I talked about this interface, there's three theories out there. The only one that I mentioned was, what was his name? Engels, who is a Nobel Prize winner. He's passed away. But there are others as well, as to how how an immaterial mind might influence the physical brain. Okay, so now this is the third leg of the syllogism, breaking that down. This is where it gets really interesting. All the rest of it was set up. Okay, human intellect exhibits vast amounts of complexity. Subjectively in consciousness, qualia, intentionality, I talked about what those were. Continuity of thought, your thought streams. Where do these thoughts come from? Why are they always related? Why is there no garbage? Why is there always a whole distinct thought? Why is this whole distinct thought always related to the first one, and the next one, and the next one, and the next one, unless you're interrupted? There's no explanation for that from a material standpoint. Constancy and resumption of self following near-death experience. I'm not going to talk too much about it, but in my paper, the most famous near-death experience, the most astounding, involved a woman named Pam Reynolds. They drained all the blood out of her head and fixed an aneurysm. And guess what? She came back, same old Pam Reynolds. There was no molecular activity in her brain for an hour, but somehow everything was restored. If you took a computer and unplugged it, everything would work fine because they have something called non-volatile memory. But the brain can't have anything like non-volatile memory. Nothing like that. They cooled her body down to 60 degrees. She was under deep anesthesia, and then they tipped her up like they're draining the oil out of a car and drained all the blood out of her head so they could fix the aneurysm. And she came back, and instantly she had a near-death experience, which she said was continuous. From the time of her first out-of-body experience watching the surgeons, which she was able to recount to their amazement, to the last one where she was being revived. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, a few slides. Dreams. I'll talk a lot about dreams. Hallucinations, alien abductions, and DMT trips. These are incredible proofs against materialism. But not everybody's been abducted by aliens. Everybody has dreams. And not everybody DMT is highly illegal. Not everybody has a near-death experience. Shared death experiences, unbelievably fascinating stuff. Dreams are the phenomenon of human intellect that exhibit massive amounts of common complexity, that is the most intellectually accessible and is most quantifiable and is the easiest to identify with. Okay, I have a section on complexity. I'm going to assume that you kind of know what complexity is. Just a lot of things intricately connected together and working together. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I will distinguish it between two things. Again, in forums when you're debating, it's very common that order will be confused with complexity. An ordered pair like this could be created through an algorithm. It's deterministic. This, which is part of a Shakespeare sonnet, is not. Okay? Randomness can be confused with complexity as well. Look at these two strings. This is just gobbledygook, and this is not, because we understand that it's meaningful. Now, there's a whole cottage industry in these debating forums. It's usually people who have just started getting into debate. But you see Nobel Prize winners confusing this and this. Watch the debate on my paper between Stephen Meyer and Peter Atkins. Peter Atkins, famous atheist. He doesn't get this. He does not get this distinction. Stephen Meyer is explaining it to him. He doesn't get it. And here's why. Because they'll say, you know what? If you had a random generator, this is just as unlikely as that. And this is just as unlikely as that. And they're true. They're correct. But the key is this can be generated programmatically. This can't. This can be generated, or this has no meaning. This does. So it has to have meaning, and it can't be algorithmic. Okay. Complexity has constraints and interdependencies. A few examples of complex things. I don't think anybody would deny that these things are complex. This is only a short list, of course. Mental images, dreams, thought streams, commercial businesses, weddings, houses of cards, all that stuff. Here's a poem. Okay. This is one of my favorite songs by Don McLean, Starry Night. Go back to this here. Okay, so constraints and interdependencies. You could very easily ruin this poem. If you just substitute out about 4 or 5 words, the meaning is pretty much gone. Poems are incredibly complex because of the constraints. Notice the rhyming, the rhythm, the cadence, okay? And if it's a song, of course, you've got to get the chords, and the chords have to be kind of in accordance with the cadence and so forth and the message. And he's also bound by the fact this is a song about Vincent van Gogh. He's got to be talking about something in Vincent van Gogh's paintings, right? So there's all kinds of constraints. A few word substitutions, and this is garbage. A lot of constraints, high complexity. Rock cards are complex. House of cards, I think you'd all agree that if I pulled this ace of clubs out, the whole thing would tumble. So there's all these are like interdependent with one another. It's just like life itself. Everything's interdependent with everything else. We talked about that a little bit in your presentation. Okay, my vote for the most complex molecular machine is the spliceosome. 300 proteins and about a dozen RNAs. 300 proteins. These are proteins, these are big proteins. These aren't these little tiny 150 amino acid proteins, right? Calculating this out, 300 proteins, would be on the order of Stephen Meyer's calculation, 10 to the 40,000th power. So how did this spliceosome evolve? How does it know where, it self-organizes. Watch the videos that I have links to. It just self-organizes out of nowhere. How does it know where to self-organize? How does it know what to splice? Its job is to take a string of DNA, transcript, and mRNA, and to say, okay, I've got to remove these exons or these introns. Take this exon, this one, and this one. This one I'm not going to use. Another one comes along, uses this one. Crazily complex. So this is a link, but I'll look at it now. Material causes. Okay, the key thing on this slide is material causes are deterministic. They're predictable. That's why science works. That's why you have the scientific method. You document what you're doing so somebody else can do it. Okay? It's based on math, right? So you've got, now you can, the whole claim of neo-Darwinism is, well, we can create complexity because we have this thing called natural selection. So if you have a little bit of change, random change, and we can lock that in with natural selection, then later another one, we lock that in, another one, we lock that in. That's their claim, that you can simulate complexity. Well, that has all fallen apart. And I talked about this analogy with human text. Any 100-character string, 1 in about 10 to the 100th power would be meaningful. So chance, not happening really. Intelligent cause, the rapidity with which humans can create complexity is astounding in comparison to what nature can do. The house of cards. The guy that built the house of cards probably took him 20 minutes. How long do you think it would take nature, wind blowing around, to build that? It would never happen. Okay. Problems with, now we're getting into the mind, okay? It's really interesting stuff. Problems with the emergent theory of mind. Right now, everybody's enamored with the emergent theory of mind. Property dualism, okay? People who are atheists that want to hold on to something they can claim that gives us something beyond just reductionist luck or chance or epiphenomenon, something that doesn't even really exist, have latched onto this here. There are profound problems with that, and I can only address a couple of these, really. There's a huge evolutionary problem. I'm going to skip that for now. The administrative problems, and of the administrative problems, I'm only going to talk about one. And this question of infinite regress involved in learning. I maybe should have had this up here. The singularity that you hear about, Ray Kurzweil, Stephen Hawking and Elon Musk and Gates and not Chomsky are warning us that computers they could rise up and run us out of town, right? Chomsky, I think, really nails this one because it's science fiction. It's never going to happen. Steven Pinker said the same thing. I don't know. I mean, these guys are brilliant. There's no question. But I think in my paper I say there's a fine line between genius and idiocy, is my opinion. If anybody believes that this is something to worry about. Okay, so the problem with the emergent theory of mind, the idea that a material mind emerges from a physical brain, often encounters something called an infinite regress. I have to skip some of this good stuff, unfortunately. Okay, so I think you can see that here. Let's say I use the analogy of chess. You have a certain knowledge of chess right here. If you work it and you want to develop your game of chess, somehow at time 0 you have this level, at time whatever x you have this level. Knowledge, everything in the brain, according to materialists, is neurons firing, a pattern of neurons firing. So in order to get from here to here, it has to be mitigated by some process, let's call it a learning function, and it has to converge over the same neural network. This is a simplified view, of course. So to get to here, you need this thing here. There's a dependency, okay? Well, this is a neural firing pattern, right? So what's its cause? It just didn't appear out of nowhere, right? How does the learning process evolve? So now put that up here. So it would have had to have a previous learning, right? A previous set of knowledge, learning ability. And so it would require another one to mediate, to carry it from T0 to T1, and so on. An infinite regress is a situation where you have a chain of causation of like dependencies. The dependency is the same. So in this case, there's always going to be a case that there's nothing, unless you are willing to accept magic and just say, this thing was there, I don't know how it got there, it's incredibly complex, but there it is. So unless you're willing to just say, the learning process right there, it's generic, it magically transforms anything you're trying to learn from this to this. But that's magic, okay? So that's the idea of the infinite regress. There's a chain of dependencies that is endless. Recognition, what is that? Okay, how long did it take you to figure it out? I mean, you had to say it, articulate it. It was less than a second. How the heck does your brain do that? You don't have this. There's two ways a computer recognizes things. Facial recognition is done like this. They draw little points, they measure angles. Or they just do a pixel by pixel match. They have to go through their entire database of images and check that. I really mucked up this diagram. I'm certain that this image is not in your brain somewhere, that your brain could go match against, right? That's a reasonable statement. I'm sure nothing like this could be applied to that. So how do humans do that? How does a baby at 6 months recognize its mother from all different angles, all different lighting? It's incredibly complex. This just happens to appear. Now, Ray Kurzweil wrote a recent book, Building a Mind, which is all about perception, nothing about intentionality. Where he talks about these they try to bowl you over with numbers. There's 300 million pattern recognizers, little widgets that match all this stuff up. But when you start looking at the details of how that could actually happen, it's just impossibly complex. How do they match something? How would you match this? This is new. I mean, you've never seen that before. How do they match so quickly? What about motion? What about when you're a kid, you've been in some area of the country, and now you go back 20 years later and you're driving in a car? There's not one thing that you're matching. It's just a bunch of different things. I think. Imagine how complex that would be to try and match that. The trees are bigger. Buildings are different. Okay. All right. I hope I'm not going too fast here. Okay, dreams. So as I said, if I had to pick one thing to disprove materialism, and I've thrown these up on a variety of atheist forums and the leading intelligent design forum, and nobody's had anything interesting to say. No materialist, no atheist has had any clue as to how the mind creates images. They always say, well, we'll figure it out, promissory materialism, or they say, well, the universe is causally closed, so I don't know, you got something there, but it's impossible. That's typically what you hear. But the fact is that the universe is probably not causally closed, and there's reason to believe that it's not. And dreams, because of the images they create, are astoundingly complex. You'll see a calculation in a minute. The problem for most people is that you can't analyze a dream. I've been in a dream many times. I say, man, I wish this was a dream. They are real. The images that you see are real. They are just the sound you feel. They're incredibly complex. And they're a simulation of reality. The only exception to this conundrum here is lucid dreaming is an exception. And we have a lucid dreamer right here. I wish I had that gift. There are people that would pay thousands of dollars to be able to do that. David can do it. David, since he was 6 years old, he lucid dreams. So he can actually analyze his dreams. He said yesterday that he has fun with it. He's sleeping, kind of he sees a coffee cup in his dream, he reaches out for it, and it's not there. Okay. So why are dreams so? Because of novelty. The images are not a replaying of memory. I've never had anybody contest that point. Yeah, they're related to stuff. My daughter's in softball, so I have dreams about softball. But they're people that I've never seen before, fields I've never been on, a hit that I've never seen before, whatever. And even if you made the claim that dreams are a replay of memory, that still wouldn't explain things like the ineffability of DMT and alien abductions, right? Those are super real and they're unearthly. So dream imagery is dynamic in two ways. The stuff that's moving in front of you as you're sleeping, your stuff is moving, and David does this all the time in his dreams, and you can do that. You change your perspective. So you're in an auditorium. I have a think about a dream. You're sleeping, you're in an auditorium, you can move your head. Oh, there's another person over there. Oh, look at that chandelier there. Where do those images come from? Intriguing, when I posted this, Madeline Murray O'Hare? She's an atheist, she was killed. Her son, very nice guy, he's a minister. He is really interested in dreams. And when I posted the falsification of materialism related to dreams, he chimed in and said, yeah, that's great stuff, yeah. And he said, and he mentioned back history. And I thought, what does he mean by that? Well, then I've had dreams before where you're dreaming, and I don't know how to quantify this to make a case against materialism for it. It's just interesting that when you're dreaming, like I was painting a house. I used to paint where I went through college. And I was painting a house I'd never been to before. And when I was dreaming, I dreamed that I had a memory of the whole back history of this house. Where does that come from? Yeah, I just thought it was interesting. Okay, so now I spent a lot of time talking about DMT. I talk about DMT for two reasons. Number one, materialists say, yeah, well, DMT really, it's just like near-death experiences. There are a lot of similarities, but there's a lot of differences. They're not the same. But their claim is that all the phenomena of near-death experiences have been duplicated by DMT. The collapse of time, the feeling, the loving feeling and all that is there. The images, the ineffable images. But here's something interesting. And by the way, DMT, it's now pretty well established that alien abduction phenomenon is somehow precipitated by DMT. I mentioned it the other day. Rick Strassman, expert in DMT, says that if you look at the accounts of someone claiming to be abducted by aliens and somebody in our DMT studies, you can't tell the difference if you remove DMT from the words here. So, but the key point here is that even if you claim that dreams were just a replay of memory, you cannot make that claim about DMT. Because it's just, you're seeing aliens. Seeing aliens. Sometimes you're even having sex with aliens, and they're doing all kinds of medical procedures on you. I'm guessing that hasn't happened to most people before their first alien abduction. The individual may float, curve in space, strange beings, busily moving around, doing tasks, experiences you not really understand. Abductees commonly see tunnels and cylinders and skinny bodies, big eyes, and all that stuff. Unearthly, that's the key point. It's novel, complex images. Okay, so why do dreams are such a powerful case against materialism? Okay, this is not from a dream, of course. That'd be quite a trick. But it could have been. Three frames I just showed. Okay. Complexity. Each image element. So, image element right here, a little pixel here. Okay. There's some component in your brain that is producing that blue at that little tiny point. I can't even point to anything that's small. And that one, and that one, and that one, and that one. How do they get? Just a bunch of synapses conspire together and say, all right, we're going to make this one blue. Hey, you over there, you 1,000 synapses, we're doing blue over here, you do blue as well. And then to these other ones over here, okay, you're going to make the dugout up, so you got to be kind of an off gray. You get the picture. They have to be exactly what they are for a coherent picture to occur in your mind. So the binding problem, the way these things are sequestered, bound together to get the semblance of reality, there's no material explanation. The other thing I didn't even mention, I left that off here. Dreams emulate your senses. How does that happen? I mean, think about it. Your eyes are closed. When you see something, there's a spike train that goes to your visual cortex, okay? That's a very complex spike train, modulated in some way to produce the images in your brain. Well, there's got to be some other area in your brain that precisely emulates that. And the same with your sense of touch and your sense of hearing, right? How does that magic happen? What would be the evolutionary benefit of that? And how does it get synchronized with, of course, frame by frame, right? Everything has to be in sync. Okay, I'm going to make the ball here, right? At this pixel is here. Now this set of neurons that are creating the white ball here, now I have to say, oh my gosh, we're green now. And maybe blue, whatever. Without high-level intelligence, you can't possibly do that. And all the auditory and the tactile is synchronized with one another, and so is the intentionality. When you're dreaming, you're also having thoughts about what you're seeing. So that's pulled in, integrated with your dream. So just a quick calculation to show you the staggering numbers here. Your vision is pretty good. There's a debate about this, but roughly 100 million colors the eye can see. So each individual image element, think pixel on a TV, requires a whole series of brain components, okay? And then you have a whole set on the visual frame that it appears in your dream, okay? So for a 10-second dream, and let's say there's 120 frames in a 10-second dream, or 1,200, 120 frames a second. good TV. And then in the resolution of the human vision and what occurs in a dream is far beyond any television, far beyond this. This is probably 1080p. This is probably 2 million pixels. But reality, what we can see, we're seeing far more than that. We're seeing, I'm going to suggest, well over 32 million distinct image elements, meaning elements that the granularity of which there has to be something mapped in the brain to account for. So the calculation would be 1 over 100 million possible values times the number of pixels times the number of frames. And even if you took away all that, and even if you took away all that, you're still left with the universal probability bound, the theoretical maximum number of events in the universe. There's two possibilities: random generation. Obviously, it's impossible. You just randomly come up with these images. Dream contents are programmatically generated. They're not programmatically generated because they're not replay of dream. They're not replay of. They are just novel, new, complex images. And again, the DMT and alien abductions, near-death experiences demonstrate beyond any doubt whatsoever that they can't be replays of memory. Okay. How are we doing on time? Okay, so I am going to skip this section here. Thought streams, you can read about that. It's a great one. I talked a little bit about constancy or resumption of self. Watch the video on Pam Reynolds. It'll really, really impress you. Mystical experiences. Okay. Near-death experiences, deathbed visions, after-death experiences offer additional evidence of complexity because of the novelty and the ineffable nature of them. Near-death experience accounts, out-of-body accounts of near-death experiences are theoretical, meaning that when people, it's not that people are, when they have a near-death experience, are saying, yeah, I was, I woke up, I saw all this stuff. They're claiming they see what is going on, and they tell the doctor, they said, like Pam Reynolds said, she had 100 dB clickers in her ear every 10th of a second. She's in deep anesthesia, and she heard the female cardiologist say, hey, we got a problem, we can't drain the blood out of the artery in her thigh. She heard that because she was above the doctor watching the whole thing. And then the doctor said, try the other leg. She recounted that, and the doctors are saying, unless she got incredibly lucky, and it goes on, there's tens of thousands of cases like that. Hers is the most important case because it was well documented. Near-death out-of-body experience, a single veridical out-of-body experience would disprove materialism hands down. The problem is it's subjective, unless you've had one. Then it's proof for you. Shared death experiences are potentially corroborative. I'll talk a lot about that. This is a very new thing, and this in particular is an unbelievable phenomenon. I'll cover this in the next quotes here. Now, so the Urantia book says this: you're not allowed to communicate with anybody. So if that's true, then what are these things? When people have an after-death communication with somebody, which is very common. Sometimes it's visual, sometimes it's auditory, sometimes it's just a sense. My theory would be that they're facsimiles potentially created by the adjuster. Okay? And then we have a theory to offer. These people aren't making this stuff up. Okay. Deathbed vision. Fairly common thing. This is Roger Ebert. I don't know if you've ever seen this. He died a few years ago. This is his wife talking. Roger looked beautiful. This is the day before he died. He looked peaceful, young. Roger was an agnostic, Roger Ebert. Something really interesting happened the week before he passed. He couldn't speak. He had cancer of the throat, I think. He wrote down a note. This is all an elaborate hoax. His wife said, what's a hoax? He was talking about this world, this place. He said it was all an illusion. This is what people in near-death experience say. He was not confused. He described what he saw as a vastness that you cannot possibly imagine. It was a place where the past, present, and future were all happening at once. It's hard to put into words. It's exactly what, like Eben Alexander said. Time collapses. Well, that happens in DMT as well. All right, this is a tragic case. It's an out-of-body experience. This was taken from a dissociation forum. This is a woman 54 years ago was assaulted, and she instantly left her body and remembered that her head was hovering over the corner of her bed on top of her brother. She was worried about they sleeping in the same barn but in different locations. So she went out of her body and was over here looking at her brother while she was being assaulted over here, and she had no sense of what was going on in her corporeal self. But then after she was worried about her brother, so she couldn't just leave. Then she heard distant sobbing and shuddering, and she thought, well, somebody else is in danger. So she was concerned about that person. She started to look back towards what was her, and she was immediately back in her body, and then says, the deep shuddering, sobbing sounds were coming from me. I sometimes think I was near death, or I had died, and my spirit left my body. I certainly had no awareness of my body or what was happening to me. Out-of-body accounts for near-death experiences are similar, except not tragic like this. Okay, so here is a after-death communication, Michael Crichton, in his book Travels. So think the possibility that the adjuster could do things to help you out. Okay, can put any image into your brain that might be helpful. Michael Crichton did not have an easy time with his father. So this guy, Gary, put him in a trance. He was going to do some astral traveling, which he claims like guided meditation. So his grandmother appears, and then his dad appears in the dream. Misty, like everything else in this place, he says. I didn't want to have a long conversation. I was quite nervous. Suddenly he embraced me. In the instant of that embrace, I saw and felt everything in my relationship with my dad. I saw all the things he had done for me, every aspect of our relationship at once, instant compassion, acceptance, love, incredibly powerful. I burst into tears. My father had gone. We never said a word. There was no need to say anything. I can't explain it to Gary. I couldn't explain it to anybody. Something extraordinarily profound happened to me. My relationship with my father had been resolved in a flash. There wasn't time to cry. Now that it was over, crying seemed after the fact. So this is real. He's just not making this stuff up. Something really happened, and the only explanation be some kind of a spiritual. If it's the case he didn't really see his father, okay, given the statement of the Urantia book, then it's I use the term facsimile. They can throw any image they want into your mind, I suppose. Now we get into the really, really interesting stuff. Alan Botkin, who practices right up here in Lincolnshire, Illinois, treated people with post-traumatic stress syndrome. Treating a guy who had, I guess maybe fell in love over a Vietnamese woman who was killed right in front of him. And through a set of eye movements, Alan Botkin puts him in some sort of a trance. I don't know anything about it other than that. And she saw this woman, this Vietnamese woman. So he had been crying. He was self-ostracized. Just stayed in the basement because he couldn't deal with life. That episode was so traumatic. So Alan Botkin puts him through this thing where his mind, actually, back up. Neither of us was prepared what happened next. The tears that had been flowing in his closed eyes suddenly stopped, and he smiled broadly. He giggled softly. When he opened his eyes, he was euphoric. When I closed my eyes, I saw Lee as a beautiful woman with long hair and a white gown surrounded by radiant light. She seemed genuinely happier and more content than anything than anyone and thanked me for taking care of her. The agony of his grief somehow produced, this is what his theory was, produced an hallucination based on fantasy or wishful thinking. I had never witnessed such a thing, a response in psychotherapy. I'm going to summarize this. So then what he found, so you're thinking, well, it's a hallucination, okay. But what he found was, if there was somebody else who had some kind of a loving relationship with the patient in the room, and he did these eye movements, induced after-death communication, that sometimes the person in the room had the exact same set of images. And it's happened multiple times at this point. I mean, this is something he's documented in his book. It wasn't just a one-time thing. And the first time it happened was this incident here, which I'm not going to read, but it was a psychologist who was in training and got to know this person who was grieving for his uncle, I guess. He put him through the eye movements, and the psychologist, who had an empathetic relationship with the patient, saw the same images, except there was one exception. So this is his statement. To preclude the afterlife explanation, skeptics may have to argue that two people sharing an induced after-death communication really aren't sharing the perception of spirits of the deceased, but somehow, magically, telepathically sharing the same hallucination. And that goes for near-death experiences too. People on their deathbed will sometimes see a vision, and other people, this happened to Ray Moody as well, they see the same thing. Multiple people sometimes, not just the deceased person and one other person. And there's supposed to be hundreds of these cases. Don't know. Again, this is the key right here. This Dr. Manelli up in Milwaukee, they've been working together, and they found that the way the shared induced after-death communication can occur is if there is a loving relationship. The energy of an induced after-death communication is linked to the power of love. I'm going to skip that one right there. Okay. Very strange incident here. Andrew Zimmerman, we watched Bizarre Foods?
Yep.
Okay. Did you see the one where he was in Africa? The Bushman? Okay. This is his statement. The movie doesn't show it all. The movie's interesting, but this shaman put his hands on him, on his chest. And Zimmerman said he had an out-of-body experience and could see from above the shaman touching him. And then he was back in his body, and he said, I saw images of this guy, his name is, the shaman, thumbing through the book that contained all the pictures of my life. I saw images of my childhood I had not remembered in years. Pictures of my mother and me walking on a beach and shelling, very strong images. Here's a really interesting thing. You've heard about when people have an after-death or a near-death experience, they have life review, their whole life flashes in front of their eyes. Well, in developing worlds, in more primitive societies, they don't see it like a video, like a panoramic video, like Westerners see it. They see it as a great teacher thumbing through the images of their life. It's very interesting. So vitalism. I'm not going to have much time to talk about this, but vitalism is the one area that the Urantia book is completely out of sync with science. There are very few scientists that believe that it's something like a vital spark. My opinion after looking into this is that vitalism is probably true if it's not misunderstood. And we talked about this yesterday. I think cells have intelligence, and I don't think it's just cybernetic. I think it is, they really have some kind of primitive abilities, primitive agency that keeps everything working. This guy, Roy Britton, famous biologist, there are no known genes that individually encode large amounts of information specifying the pattern of development. There's also no reason to believe that the spatial specifications might be concealed in the vast stretches of non-coding DNA, junk DNA. Self-assembly is a logical replacement for a potential overarching regulatory concept for which no specific mechanisms can presently be identified. So they're admitting that they don't know how all these things happen in the cell. Okay? So they're just saying vitalism is out of the question because it involves something that's supernatural. It's one of these simplifying assumptions they're making. When you look at the complexity of the operation of the cell and what's going on during morphogenesis, how do these particles know where they're going? How do they get, besides diffusion, which is just luck? Oh, they just bump into each other and they end up in the right place. I'm not buying that. I don't think that is a good explanation. I think there's something going on. I think the biggest story this century in science is going to be that people are going to realize that the cell has some kind of intelligence that is not strictly programmatic. That's my gut feel. If you said that in a university environment, you'd be run out of town. These are a bunch of statements by James Shapiro. I'm going to skip to the next one. Yeah, interesting statement he makes. If such investigations about how things work in biology in new areas are more than strictly material, so be it. As long as we stay within the realm of natural processes. I don't know what he could mean by that. Well, what he means by that is cybernetic. He means that somehow the cells have some intelligence. Not immaterial intelligence, that somehow has been produced by, and he would have to resort to some kind of Darwinian process because that's the only thing left. So he's kind of in a difficult spot. When you ask him, I've exchanged emails with him many times, and I don't know. I don't know how, it was all in the earliest cells, and that's all he'll say. When you ask him how the eye evolved, I said, do you think it evolved all at once? He says, no, it evolved in a series of steps, big steps. It's still impossible by chance. So that's why he hasn't gotten as much traction, because what he's saying, the only alternative to if you take verbatim what he's saying, that's why the intelligent designs love this guy, because he's speaking the truth. He's saying what they've been saying for years. Neo-Darwinism is just, it just doesn't explain anything. And he's saying that. Okay, questions? Help I wasn't going too fast. I had to rush through, kind of, so. Yes, sir.
Just a comment about the ability to recognize patterns that we have and the computers don't. We all experience that security patterns, and they say, please repeat these letters. And they give you something that confuses the computer, but it's pretty obvious to us what the letters are.
Good point. A CAPTCHA, whatever they call them, yeah.
So that's
that is a very good point, yeah. Yeah, the computer can't match that.
They put something in there, change the shape, and the computer doesn't know what it is.
Yeah.
Keep the automatic programs from just generating a lot of those.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, anything else? Yeah.
As you probably know, Dr. Sadler did a lot of research into strange phenomena in his earlier days. And he attended seances, supposedly, with people who claimed to have contacts with unseen beings, and with angels and other possible personalities. He wrote many books on the subject, and then, of course, when the Urantia revelation came along, he was having contacts, discussions, experiences with many beings who are outlined in the Urantia book. And in fact, he had some personal encounters with these unseen personalities, as we know. And his attitude towards some of these things changed considerably over the course of his life, from doubt and disdain even for many of these events. And he came to believe that it was possible to not contact the dead, the deceased, but many beings who were spiritual in the true sense of the word. He also had some experiences himself that were unexpected and quite a shock to him.
I think all this stuff would come to, there's a woman that had one of these after-death visitations from her mother, and she quit her career and went to become a chaplain at a hospital. And I talked to her. I said she was a mother of a girl on my daughter's softball team. And she said, I said, was it a dream really? And she said, it was not a dream. It was not a dream. It got my attention. It was real. As real as I'm talking to you. That's what they all say in all these experiences. It's more, in fact, the near-death experiences and the DMT, they say it's more real than real. I don't know how it can be more real than real, but that's what they say. Yes?
Neil, I want to really thank you for kind of putting this all together and, the background information. It's really helpful. And the courage really in going on these lists and talking to people about a different idea, because it takes a lot of courage to keep doing that and having people push back. But I do think, thought adjuster, but we also have cosmic mind and the mind circuits. And so, I could see maybe some of this, maybe not thought adjusters as much as the mind circuits as a way also of
yeah, I know. There seems to be an
information.
arbitrariness. I mean, obviously not everybody has them, right? So why does it, when somebody is under a similar cardiac arrest, some people, it's rare, relatively uncommon. Why do some people have it, some people don't? Why do some people have after-death visitations and some people don't? Why do some people deathbed visions and some people don't? I don't know.
I think you answered it. I think a lot of. So I had last week, I did a memorial for a 93-year-old friend, and his great-granddaughter got 5 distinct visits from him with the exact same message for great-grandma. And the bond between her and her great-grandfather was huge. And so, in some fashion, perhaps love creates the capacity for conductivity of information.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. Yes.
Well, I also think there's a whole borderland that we know very little about after death. I used to do a lot of bereavement groups and stuff like that, and tale after tale after tale of real experiences. That wasn't the point I wanted to make, though. I was thinking in terms of where you were talking about the eye movements. And that is a standard practice now that people use in psychotherapy, EMDR, in terms of helping people process old traumas or experiences. And I'm thinking it's sort of like where someone has a schizophrenic experience or a transpersonal experience. And I think that the reality is that our capacity to deal with, in a sense, both ends of the spectrum. I've had DID patients who've had identity disorder, the multiples, and they are able to leave their bodies. They have initially they have no awareness of their different identities, but their brain has had the capacity for them to be able to separate from the trauma. These are usually ritual abused kids. But they can separate from the trauma in a way that they can function on the planet and be disassociated from it. So I think what we know is that we have the ability to consciously dissociate from what's happening, whether we're on the table being operated on and we go up and we can see what's up in the corner of the room, or we're being traumatized. But it tells us that we have these incredible abilities with our brain and our mind to survive, to function, to move forward, etc. And I just think it's fascinating that we have both possibilities.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As personal beings, we have the capacity for self-consciousness. So I can sort of understand the materialist perspective about consciousness, perhaps coming from different areas of the brain. But self-consciousness, what's the response to self-consciousness?
In the philosophy of mind, there are very few substance dualists that I'm aware of. Richard Swinburne. There's a few. There just aren't that many. It seems like the idea that there's an immaterial mind. Actually, I think what the case is, it's the same with neo-Darwinism. I think there are many people in the universities that are just keeping their mouth shut. You know, I believe, I think this stuff is nonsense you're talking about. I'm in a total line. I got a couple years left in my career. I'm not going to rock the boat. I'm not going to be run out. And it's the same way with the mind. But I don't know. I just see people I interact with in the office, dinner parties, on the various forums. People just intuitively believe that the brain is all there is. What else could there be? What are you talking about? That's, the superstition. It's kind of a soul or something like that. Well, actually, even the group out in California, CTNS, Robert Russell and Nancy Murphy, these are theistic evolutionists. They've given up on the soul. They've thrown the towel in. They've said, yeah, okay, science is saying that the brain is all there is, so there's no soul, forget about ensoulment. So I sent an email to one of the guys there, I forgot what his name escapes me at the moment. I said, well, but how do you explain immortality? It's just the brain. He said, well, it could be resurrected, I said, well, resurrected at what point? What if you're a 5-year-old? What if you're an 80-year-old? He said, well, maybe it's resurrected at the same age as Jesus was crucified. I said, well, what about people before Jesus? And basically just said, well, I don't know, a lot of unanswered questions. And he said that must have been a fan of Garcia, was a good musician. So he said, keep on trucking. And so that was when I kind of gave up on those guys, frankly. I just said, you know what? So then I started looking at closer at the intelligent design guys, and they were saying things that made more sense. Like, yeah, there is an immaterial mind, probably. And there is. Neo-Darwinism doesn't make any sense. And that rang true to me, much more true than theistic evolutionists who were saying, whatever science says is true, and then we're going to try to carve out and figure out how God could fit into that, even if there's no soul. So that's where they lost me. Yes, sir.
Urantia book refers to the transfer of information from one member of the Reserve Corps to another member of the Reserve Corps so that the information doesn't get lost. Now, it seems like that might be related to some of the experiences. Now, I don't know whether it's conscious in that case, but somehow the information gets over. So, how would you relate that to all of these experiences, or would you?
Yeah, I mean, I honestly, these are very often just common folk, that have these experiences. You see everything from dentists to doctors to truck drivers to plumbers. Evan Alexander was a brain surgeon. He was an agnostic materialist. He's completely changed. I've gone to lectures, exchanged emails with him. And he still considers himself a man of science, but his view is that science has been shanghaied, it's not his term, by materialists. And actually there's a statement in the Urantia book, in the last section of my paper, I mentioned, it says something to the effect that complete secularization of science, actually I think it had, can only lead to disaster of science education. And so that's the kind of thing that he's fighting against.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because the complete secularization of culture is probably due to the complete secularization of religious institutions.
I'm not sure what you mean.
Well, the Enlightenment was a response to, on the part of many who became atheists, Bayle and a number of people became atheists in response to the unspiritual nature of the religious institutions that they were dealing with.
Oh, yeah.
So if you were in France in 1700, you didn't see a cardinal who looked particularly spiritual,
Yeah, okay.
nor in the Vatican.
Yeah. Sure, but that was.
So again, this is all part of the history of our planet. So we don't necessarily want to make anybody out as good guys or bad guys. This is just, if you will, the dialectic of the history of thought,
Yeah.
which I think it's important to see that dialectic as we consider these subjects.
Yeah, I guess part of my frustration is that this, as Nagel's comment, he says retrospectively, I find his acceptance of neo-Darwinism is, I forgot what the term he used, but unbelievable. There's a point, I was talking with a relative of mine, and he was talking about Ray Kurzweil. I said, oh yeah, Ray Kurzweil's a genius. And I told him, I said, there's got to be a word that's reserved for somebody who gets the big questions right. He may be smart, he may be clever. I'm going to reserve the word brilliant to people who are in a field and get the big question right. The big question in biology is, can material processes produce all these wonderful things? My prediction is in 10 years, 20 years, it's going to be obvious to everybody that that's not the case. So what do you say about Richard Dawkins, the brilliant Richard Dawkins? Maybe he wasn't so brilliant if he didn't get the big question right. And to me, it's, yeah, so maybe that's the term, brilliant, honest, I don't know what it is, but there's something that you're just missing because you're blind or whatever.
But the Urantia book suggests that there's methodology associated with religion as well as science. And there are different methods. And so Francis Bacon, who was sort of the father of the Enlightenment, said, genius without method, proper method, takes you totally off the wrong direction.
Right, but now someone like Einstein, he actually, a brilliant guy, nobody would deny that. But he was a guy that actually stood back and said, what is the meaning of all this? You know? Whereas a lot of people just dig in and say, they never step back and say, can I be wrong about this? This seems very hard to believe. There's so many people that either they're not saying so, or they just never do it. Maybe it's brain trainment, I don't know. Maybe they didn't need to visit Jeffrey Schwartz and but there's never been a time in my life that I've just been so immersed that I've never actually stepped back periodically and said, do I need to reassess here about being a Cubs fan, for example? It seems like that's a common, an important intellectual thing that should be part of a smart person's arrows in their crispin.
Bruce Johnson yesterday spoke of Carl Jung, and Jung said that the oldest medicine is enchantment. And I fear that many of your atheistic, materialistic, naturalistic individuals who are dogmatic have sort of lost the enchantment. Einstein never lost the enchantment of what he was doing. It was always something exciting to him and numinous. And when you lose that enchantment and the medicine is gone, I think you're in a dark alley without any way out.
Yeah. Yes.
You reminded me of Jesus when he prayed, Father, I thank you for hiding this truth from the clever and revealing it to the common person. It must have seemed good to you. Something like that. I'm paraphrasing, but I think he was referring to the fact that some of the cleverest people miss the boat.
Yeah, it's a very peculiar phenomenon. I consider myself open-minded, so I don't think I've ever had that problem. But I know people that are just, their opinions are just immutable. You just realize they're not even listening to what you're saying.
Yeah, but see, they're not really technically now practicing science.
because they have totally closed their minds, okay? And, you know, Dawkins is right in there. As far as he is not practicing science when you close your mind, because method tells you will never prove it, and you must always be seeking. And when you prove it, then the questioning is stopped and the science is stopped, okay? And so these people that have already said, you know, well, I have proved that God does not exist, that there is no divine action in the world, you know, then scientific inquiry, you have put the kibosh on the whole thing, okay? And so, and that's on both, you know, both sides of this, you know, of this argument that, and so it's where you're still trying to push the level of human ignorance further out, you know, and you know, that's one of the things like what Firestein says, you know, in ignorance what drives science. I mean, I don't know what necessarily his personal, you know, belief is, but the thing for the scientist to stay creative in everything is to stay open-minded to all possibilities. But scientists are humans, and they buy into the dogma of their particular discipline just like anybody else. And you go to these big meetings, and they may be pulling off in their corners and all that. But at that point, most rational scientists step back and say, hey guys, you're not practicing science anymore because you are too invested in one place to the exclusion of everything else. And that's not science.
Yeah. Actually, David's had his hand up for a moment.
Did you have your hand up too, or did you just feel you needed to say something since he said David?
You have the floor.
I haven't said anything. I'm just a lowly observer here, in great part because my orientation is more the humanities. Literature teacher. And at this point, I think there's something that's really relevant, which Gard opened up by asking the question about self-consciousness, which implies an ability to step outside of yourself and be objective to a certain degree. And what I'm hearing, and then what you commented, Neil, about the difference with Einstein, for instance, because he kept questioning. And there's another element that I think figures in here. I've read the opinion, and I believe it, that people who use figurative language, which is predicated on comparisons, tend to be fairly intelligent. Of course, Einstein did that all over the place. But one form of figurative language is irony, and irony implies the ability to step outside and make perceptions of things that are being compared with one another. So, in first place, don't trust somebody with no sense of humor. I mean, that's a big thing right there. And it just, all this kind of came together to me because of all the really funny, witty things and self-deprecating things that Einstein would say. I mean, they're just a boatload of quotes. I think he was the one who said, wouldn't it be wonderful if you would marry and have children with Marilyn Monroe? And he said, yeah, but what if they look like me and think like her? He also said, he also said, because I noticed one of your people up there compared the importance of common sense, but he said common sense is nothing more than a series of prejudices laid into the mind before the age of 18. And what he was saying is that people, it's a kind of a priori sort of approach to things. Well, they said so, it's got to be true, and if you think differently, it's not true. Somebody with a sense of irony and objectivity doesn't do that. They step outside and they question. So anyway, I would insert that self-consciousness, objectivity, awareness also means being able to bring in these other dimensions of point of view to the facts.
I'd like to step back just a little bit to a question you raised earlier about cell ability to make decisions or seeming to show intelligence. I've come across a number of biologists, it seems in their later years, perhaps when their careers are established, they're secure, and they're free to say things that aren't that
I
acceptable
think
to
you're
your
absolutely
colleagues,
correct on that.
have said things like, how does a cell know when to divide?
Yeah.
How does a cell know that it should grow and try to divide? We know that E. coli can reproduce, can divide every 20 minutes under ideal circumstances. We know that E. coli can use their flagellum to project them toward higher concentrations of sugar and other nutrients in the medium. We know that paramecium will flee the light from a light microscope. And there seems to be intelligence of some level. Now, we're familiar with the concept of non-teachable mind. And we know that it's not based on neurons in a single cell. That's impossible. But what is it based on? I'm just raising some questions that we haven't even attempted to answer, but yet we seem to, many of us have seen it happen, but we haven't had the curiosity or the ability, and maybe we never will, to really discover what is really going on at that single cellular level.
Yeah, Brian Ford is a guy, a British biologist who's up in the years, and he's probably one of these guys that I don't care what anybody thinks of me, I'm going to speak the truth. And he's an expert on cell intelligence. In fact, I have a couple links to a lecture he gave in the paper, and he talks about how cells seem to know where to go. If they get a rupture, they know how to repair it. So yeah, I think.
Hi, Joe.
Well, we've run out of time, but that's a great lead-in, Ralph. I'd like just, perhaps for the future, just to raise that question again about an interface. How does this work?
That was one area in the book. I cited 3 different theories. They're all speculative. They're all based on Copenhagen interpretation of
What
quantum
about
mechanics.
as an experienced Urantia book reader? Have you got any speculation about what's going on with the interaction between mind and hormones and neurons?
My real answer to that would be beats me. I mean, I really don't. I don't have any idea how. The only thing I could you could make inferences. Actually, that's even hard to do. What you're asking maybe is first step in what you asked maybe would be to compartmentalize what you think would be the role of the brain and what the mind does.
No, actually, well, the connection between the mind and the brain even. That's a good place to start.
Well, somehow the immaterial mind has to affect the physical brain. And I don't see any other way that could happen other than through quantum indeterminacy. That was the whole reason why quantum mechanics was such a big thing, and why classical physics seemed to deny interactionalism and support causal closure determinism.
It's a great start to the answer. So,
Yeah.
but it's a long discussion.
It's a very contentious debate. If you that area of debate, you get in a forum and start talking about that. It is just, and I try to steer clear of that. I try to say things very safe in that case, because once you say something that's completely outlandish, then nobody's going to listen to you. But that's only true for someone who believes in God. If you don't believe in God, you can say any garbage you want, and you're welcome back, and that's the difference, the double standard. You cannot make a mistake on a forum if you're pushing the idea that God exists, especially when you're on an atheist forum. You can't make any mistakes. Zero.
Well, Dawkins gets fairly
Yeah,
poor
Dawkins-
remarks. Yeah, but he gets very poor remarks in the philosophy department. I mean, his last book, he got so trashed because, his philosophy. And he's not a philosopher, and he sucks at it. I'm sorry.
No, you're absolutely correct. Actually, there's a guy, William Lane Craig. He is I don't know if you've heard of him. He is a Christian apologist. He rips these guys apart. Sam Harris, he was in a debate with Sam Harris. Even Sam Harris in his handbook said, yeah, we didn't do very well here. William Lane Craig, actually went to school at Wheaton, Illinois, and Dawkins refuses to debate him. And Dawkins refused to debate Stephen Meyer as well. Dawkins, going back to your comment, was trumpeting this junk DNA for years. See, that just proves that there's nothing, there's no way you could consider the cell design if you got 95% of it as junk, for heaven's sakes. It was just a big laughing stock, and he made great hay with it. Well, now with the ENCODE project that came out that said 80% of the DNA is transcribed and presumably does something, and it's appearing it does something, and that was only 150 cells out of the 1,000 cell types they had. The comment by the ENCODE scientists was that number of junk DNA transcribed, 80% of it, is probably going to go to 100%. That was their comment.
Yeah, there's a great deal of evidence to suggest that junk DNA is not junk.
Right.
And many of the very difficult concepts to understand is how does the right arm end up on the right side? And how does the head end up the head side? And how does the eye, for example, of the fruit fly be on the proper side, proper area of the head?
Symmetrical about the head.
Yes.
And all the cells, it's just amazing.
And so there's a great deal of genetic signaling going on. And the other major area is the timing of when a given gene is turned on and when it's turned off. And when you get to be 6'4", some of the genes are turned off.
Yeah.
And how does that happen? There's a whole host of those sorts of very intricate details about the genetic expression that we're only beginning to appreciate.
Well, the recent discovery seems to be, and it's pretty well supported at this point, is that the information is not in the DNA for development.
Well, we may not know for sure yet.
Yeah, it's still open question.
We know there's DNA in mitochondria. And we know, for example, when cells separate, that if the organelles do not separate more or less in equal terms, the young cell cannot produce. And that's because the organelle development information is not in the DNA. It's in the organelles themselves. So there's a lot of complexities here that we are only beginning to appreciate.
Okay, we got to wrap up here again.
Right.
Right.
Okay, and one more question from our listening audience, and it's to Nigel and to Dick. And it's a really simple question. How does the automaton fit in the atom?
See the paper.
It's everywhere.
Yeah.
Oh, that's very
Every part
well.
of the atom has to have some quantity of automatons. So every part, because that is the basic part of it. That's what I feel. So everything can be broken down, right? To the automaton.
There's a link to the script I had yesterday on the the forum website. So wherever this is being recorded, that's a link to all the papers, and so that's very well mapped out in yesterday's paper.
Yeah. Bravo. Very well. Neil Kendall?